All right, welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue where we left off as far as our material for reproductive system. So just going back to where we were continuing with the female reproductive system. Again, we have seen this side angle like transverse view. That's just one of the methods that you'll see it, but the more likely diagram that you'll see is this more front perspective. Again, it's classically referred to as like the deer antlers look with the fallopian tubes and everything involved. So just make sure we're comfortable with the structures that we need to be aware of that you're going to see on our test next week relating to reproductive system. Okay. So if we continue moving down, we were discussing the uterine tubes. We were discussing the uterus. We talked about the structures of the uterus as far as the endometrium, the myometrium, and the perimetrium. So those three layers. Again, the prefix is all you need to worry about. That's literally all you need to pay attention to as far as remembering. Endo means inner, myo means middle, also muscular, and peri means outer. We've seen it in a number of different organs before, so this is not anything different. Okay, finally, we're reaching the end, or the beginning, should we say, but the end of all these female reproductive structures. The vagina, also known as the vaginal canal, or the birth canal. The vagina extends from the cervix to the exterior of the body. It is behind the bladder and in front of the rectum, so similar to the womb, as we've seen before in other pictures. As we mentioned before, it serves as the birth canal, so when the baby is in late third trimester and has developed as much as possible, it's time to get out, right? It's time to start growing on its own without the necessity of the mother as far as being in utero. The cervix dilates, expands substantially, then the baby will progress out through the vagina. Now, as we mentioned, that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always play out that way. There are instances where the baby's just flat out too big. There are instances where the baby could be coming out feet first, which could also be a massive problem because the umbilical cord could actually choke the baby while passing through. We call that a breech birth. But there's a number of instances that can happen wrong. And that's why, thankfully, with just modern medicine, we have a procedure that is rather common nowadays, a cesarean section or C-section. Now, I will say this. It doesn't mean that a woman goes into pregnancy and or into labor, and immediately just says, okay, I just want a C-section. We're done here. It's not always like that. There are risks for every single surgical procedure, including a cesarean. So that is something that has to be concerned and careful with when doctors and physicians and nurses make that decision. But going back to what we see here, of course, as far as during sexual intercourse, it's going to receive the penis. Something I do want to address relating to that a little bit. We talked about previously as far as a sperm have this ability to live a substantially long period of time. Estimates say that sperm living in the vagina, so after sexual intercourse, it's roughly up to 5 days. So quite some time. Again, why it lasts that long is really the semen itself nourishes the sperm, because otherwise, without the semen, there wouldn't be any hope, or very, very, very little hope of a sperm even lasting that long in the first place. But it can last up to 5 days. And as I mentioned, there have been some extreme cases of longer than 5 days, up to 2 weeks. But in most cases, that's just not really plausible. Finally, there is a structure connected to or inside the vagina that partially closes the vagina until it is ruptured. It's known as the hymen. A common misconception that, truth be told, has just existed for far too long, is that the hymen only ruptures due to sexual intercourse. That is just frankly not the case. The hymen can rupture due to a number of different activities. Sports, it is very common for a lot of gymnasts as they're developing in their bodies, horseback riding, cheerleading. Again, there's a number of different activities that can cause a rupture of the hymen without it having anything to do with sexual intercourse. So that's just a classic misconception. Not to mention, there are some cases where with some women, because typically what happens with the hymen is after it's ruptured, that tissue does not regrow. There are some instances where the hymen actually regrows every single time it's ruptured. So as you can imagine, that would be a very painful experience for any woman having to deal with that. Okay, so that was our final structure for the female reproductive system. Now we get to talk a little bit more about how those eggs are made. And they're made through this process called oogenesis. If the ova is the proper name for the eggs, then oogenesis, the OOG part right here, the OO more specifically prefix, is telling us eggs, ova, right? As we mentioned before in a couple other videos in the past, we mentioned that the total supply of eggs are present at birth. So millions of eggs that a woman will have for her life are there before she's even born. They're developed during the in utero, in the womb. Now, those eggs don't secrete for quite some time, right? Because the only thing that instigates those eggs releasing is puberty. So it's something interesting. There is a similarity between what we observe in men, right, where they don't secrete any sort of sperm until puberty, but they also don't make any sperm until puberty. And then the same thing happening with women. Granted, they make all their eggs before they're even born, but they don't release an egg much later in life until 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It just depends on when the girl has her first period. So it does vary rather dramatically when it comes down to this. And that's what we see here. The ability to release eggs begins at puberty. Reproductive ability ends at menopause. Again, we will discuss that a little bit more in detail. So as far as menopause, it is essentially the end of the sexual reproductive cycle for women. After a woman has gone through menopause, it is technically impossible for her to get pregnant. There are some very rare exceptions and some very rare cases that happen, but the whole idea is that there's no more eggs being secreted when menopause occurs. And then the oocytes are matured and developing ovarian follicles. So again, the follicles that we see is where it's going to develop these type of eggs or ova. Now, again, a lot of these specific terms we're not going to get too crazy with, just like what we saw with sperm previously, but I'm just going to go over it so that we're on the same page. The oogonia, these are these female stem cells found in a developing fetus. The oogonia will undergo mitosis to produce primary oocytes. The primary oocytes are surrounded by cells that form primary follicles in the ovary, and the oogonia no longer exists by the time of birth. So these are just basically these predecessor cells that inevitably will become those ova that will be kind of frozen, if you want to think of it that way. They're just kind of locked in stasis until they're needed, until they're released. Primary oocytes are inactive until puberty, as we've mentioned a couple times. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. We talked about that back in endocrine system because it plays a major role in men and women when it comes down to puberty. Causes primary follicles to mature. Meiosis starts inside the maturing follicle. Remember, meiosis is similar to mitosis, but you're splitting the chromosomal count, so from 46 to 23 haploid cells. Produces a secondary oocyte in the first polar body. Meiosis is completed after ovulation only if sperm penetrates. 2 additional polar bodies are produced. So what's interesting here is that meiosis, it has happened. You split the chromosomal count, but technically there's a missing step, and it won't fully happen, as we see, until the sperm fuses with it. And when the sperm penetrates and fuses with it, that's when we actually observe the chromosomal count coming back up to 46 in a healthy human, of course. Don't have to worry about all this. This is definitely a little bit more advanced than you guys need. But this is just showing us the step-by-step process on how this whole thing occurs. And here you can see way later on what has to happen when the sperm fuses together. And we undergo what we call this meiosis 2 stage. Okay, next, let's talk a little bit more about the menstrual cycle. It does have another name. It's also known as the uterine cycle. But the menstrual cycle, it is a cyclical change of the endometrium. So remember, the uterus has 3 walls of tissue, right? The endometrium is the innermost layer. So that layer sheds off. It undergoes what we call sloughing, and you'll see that in the slide. It's regulated by cyclic production of estrogen and progesterone. So for a lot of women that are on birth control, for instance, a lot of birth control, what it does is that it alters the levels of estrogen or progesterone or both, so that either no egg is released, right? Or the number of times that the menstrual cycle occurs is significantly lower. It is rather common. It just depends on the type of birth control that a woman is taking. But it's rather common for women to go months on end without having a menstrual cycle just because of this change in their hormonal levels. Granted, anything that we consume affects us, right? Many women have come out saying that specific brands of birth control they may take cause them to feel a number of different side effects that they're not very comfortable with. So it is something to be aware of. There are side effects to everything, right? There is no magic pill. So having that conscientious thought process as far as which one you're taking would be important. Now, there are 3 stages of the menstrual cycle that I do want us to know. So I'm just going to go ahead and underline or circle some of these areas. We have menses. So menses is going to be stage 1. It is when the layer of the endometrium is sloughed. Again, sloughing is literally peeling off that entire layer. And when that entire layer is peeled off, it is, of course, going to cause a little bit of blood to release too. And it will just exit out of the vagina. Now, again, the entire purpose behind this is that there was an egg previously there, but you're just getting rid of it. There's nothing left because there was never a fertilization. If there is a fertilization, none of this happens. The body can identify we have a fertilized egg, and it's not going to remove it, at least normally speaking. There are accidents, and there are miscarriages, and there are things like that can occur, but this is not in the normal sense. Stage 2, we have the proliferative stage. So as far as the proliferative stage is concerned, it is when the endometrium regenerates. So it's actually going to regrow that tissue. Just like any other body tissue, it's going to regenerate as much as it can. And then finally, we have stage 3, the secretory stage. The endometrium increases in size and readies for implantation. So what we see here is you shed off the entire endometrium, or that region of the endometrium. Going to cause bleeding, right, for a period of time. Then we have the proliferative stage where it regrows. And then the secretory stage is when it actually grows even larger as it's getting ready for a new egg. And again, if that new egg is not fertilized, it just secretes itself and the menses stage starts back up again. This menstrual cycle happens once every 28 or so days, assuming there aren't any changes, right? As I mentioned, when it comes down to birth control, many women undergo experiences where months can pass and not have a menstrual cycle. So if you're taking something that does affect hormones like estrogen and progesterone, well, then that can directly affect how often your menstrual cycle is. Speaking of menstrual cycles, something very interesting that I always gravitated towards this idea. I find it unique that when it comes down to these cycles, women can actually synchronize their cycles together. There's been a number of different studies that show when you have, let's say, a mom and a daughter living in the same house, or mom, daughter, and sisters, or whatever, or even when you're off in college and you have female roommates and you happen to be a female as well. After a period of time has passed, so let's just say a month, 2 months, it becomes very common for the women living in this one household to synchronize their menstrual cycles and for all of them to have their period at the same time. So that's a really interesting process that occurs. Again, as far as why, like evolutionarily speaking, I can only theorize as far as the possibilities associated with, well, biologically speaking, if you're thinking way back to the origins of our species, maybe it made more sense that the group of women that were in a tribe, for instance, were fertile at the same time. That's what I could theorize. And so there's been this kind of mimicry that's built into us from then on. And that whole concept of mimicry isn't just related to the menstrual cycle. It's something that we do all the time, as far as just basic subconscious behaviors. So I do find that really interesting as far as that whole idea is concerned. Let's move down a little bit. Here we see some hormonal control of the ovarian and uterine cycles. We just see how these hormones spike and adjust according to what's going on, right? So here we see the blood levels of anterior pituitary hormones. Again, we talked about that back in endocrine system, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating. And then here we see the blood levels of ovarian hormones. Progesterone and estrogen are secreted directly from the ovaries. Again, stuff we've seen before and talked about. So basically, the long story short, is once these cycles hit, you're going to see these massive spikes of these hormones in the bloodstream. And that's what's going to initiate these cycles, as we mentioned. And eventually, things do return back down as to where they should. Here we see, again, this is a great picture because not necessarily the top one, but this bottom one that shows the uterine cycle. It just shows exactly what the endometrium has to go through when it comes down to a regular cycle. We see here in the beginning, in days 1 through 5, that's on average how long the menstruating should last. You're going to see the endometrium shed itself, and as it sheds itself, it's going to rupture some blood vessels and it's going to cause some bleeding. Then inevitably, from day 5 to 15 or so, or 14, you're going to have proliferation, so it's going to regrow. Then from about day 14 to about day 27 or so, you're going to have this secretory phase where the endometrium actually grows significantly higher, much higher than normal, as you can see. And the entire reason for that is that it's trying to prepare for an egg, especially if there's going to be a fertilized egg. And in the instance that there is no fertilized egg, well, we see this massive drop off and then you restart menstruation again. So like I mentioned earlier, not a bad idea to just be aware the menstrual cycle, just like ovulation, similar concept, is going to be this 28-day process. That said, interestingly enough, if you do look at this picture up here, notice when the egg releases, right? We have follicular when it's being formed, luteal when it's degrading inside in the ovaries as far as the compounds that secreted it. But the egg actually releasing on average about day 14 in about the middle of a cycle, that's exactly the time that the endometrium is expanding to try to prepare for that egg. So it's perfectly synced. It is perfectly synced. The body is trying to prepare for that. So that's the whole idea. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop. We're at a pretty good place right now. Like I said, this section will probably be a little longer than 7 videos just because there is quite a bit of content, but we're making good progress. So we'll continue where we left off. Thanks, guys, for tuning in.